to this launch. Remind you, this study was one which the government asked us to specifically do in the light, I think, probably of the challenges that the transmission network has faced. Well, electricity, as you all know, is fundamental to almost every element of modern life. As we decarbonise energy generation, shift away from fossil fuels for heating and transport, that reliance is only set to increase. So we need an electricity system with the capacity, flexibility and resilience to cope with whatever we demand of it over the rest of the century. That means upgrading and investing in both additional generation and storage and expanding the country's transmission grid, which NIC identified in his report as Networks Commissioner to the previous government. But today's report is about the third pillar of the system, the low voltage electricity distribution networks which connect homes and most businesses and around a third of generation to that high voltage supply. It's often overlooked. Partly that's because electricity distribution has been in pretty much a steady state for a long time. Electricity demand has also been flat or falling, and there is spare capacity in much of the network, so the impetus to change things simply hasn't been there. The distribution network operators have also proved adept at using local flexibility measures to manage the need for further investment in the network, which has kept network costs low for consumers. Added to this, a lot of the infrastructure is also out of sight. While we all regularly walk past substations, they generally aren't very intrusive, and about 70% of the wires in the distribution network are underground. So no surprise that distribution is not always front of everybody's minds. But the reality now is that we're facing a rapidly increasing demand and a growing waiting list for connections to the local networks, such as new sources of generation, new EV charging stations, or power-hungry data centres. In such circumstances, the current approach will not get us very far. It would be unwise to maintain a steady-state approach to the distribution network when the rest of the energy system is undergoing a transformational change to support the decarbonisation of the economy. So, today's report sets out how the government, the regulator, the system operator, NISO, and the distribution network operators themselves need to think differently about investing in and planning our distribution networks to meet future demand. On the transmission networks, as Nick identified in his own report, we're currently playing catch-up, and we're in a race to build the new capacity we'll need to deliver clean power in 2030 and beyond. The good news is that on distribution, it's not too late. We can get ahead of the curve and, crucially, stay there. But that requires us to act now to build the capacity needed for the future. Our recommendations will ensure that the big prize on offer, low-cost, secure and sustainable energy that supports economic growth and development, as well as decarbonisation, does not slip from our grasp. So I'll now hand over to Nick to run through the main recommendations we're making on investment, flexibility and regulation to support this. Sadie and Andy will then briefly summarise the recommendations we're making on improving connections and how we deal with some of the barriers to delivery. And then we can answer your questions. So, Nick. Tom, sorry. No, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Tom's beginning the slides.
Thank you, John. And good morning, everyone. Our starting point is a clear one. We know demand for electricity will double by 2050 as we decarbonise the economy. This chart shows the expected change in electricity demand from 2024 to 2050. Take particular note of the acceleration needed in the 2030s. That's really not very far away. We know using electricity flexibly is going to be crucial. Indeed, our analysis in the report suggests that customer demand flexibility could reduce the amount of distribution network investment required by 15%. And we know system-wide flexibility could save billions of pounds a year in avoided generation and transmission investment as well. But flexibility isn't a panacea. Even with a highly flexible system, we will still need a rapid expansion in network capacity. Our estimate is that to meet growing demand, we'll need additional network investment in the region of 37 to 50 billion between today and 2050. This is at least a doubling of the current annual allowances for load-related expenditure. That's the proportion of investments specifically focused on meeting increased demand. And that's on top of all the business as usual investment that's needed to maintain and renew the existing network. We've seen the consequences of investing too late in transmission. In 2022, energy bill payers paid £1.4 billion in constraint costs because the transmission network did not have the capacity to transmit all the energy generated by renewables to where it needs to go. We need network capacity to be there when consumers want to switch to a heat pump or install an EV charger. Otherwise, the pace of electrification will falter. It also needs to be there to support economic growth and development. Without network capacity, new homes can't be built where they're needed, and investment in business and industry will go elsewhere. Ensuring capacity is there when it's needed requires a more proactive approach to investment, with a higher risk appetite for building ahead of need. The risks of falling behind need now outweigh the risks of building ahead of need, particularly given how quickly demand is projected to accelerate during the 2030s. That extra investment is going to need to be paid for, and 37 to 50 billion pounds certainly sounds a lot of money. In terms of bills, it translates to about an additional £5 to £25 per household per year. It varies from year to year. We know we can't treat any increase in customer costs lightly, particularly given continued pressures on the cost of living. And while delaying investment could reduce short-term costs to consumers, we're clear that that would increase the burden on future consumers. It's also helpful to put this into context. Network costs are only a small part of people's bills, around 5 to 10% of the total bill. And our analysis shows that this investment in our distribution networks is still compatible with getting energy bills falling. And that's provided that the government actions, as it is doing in many cases, the recommendations we made in the second National Infrastructure Assessment. Indeed, it should actually support falling bills by allowing more low marginal cost renewable power onto the system around the country. So what do we need to do to make this happen, to make this shift to proactive investment? Perhaps the most obvious shift is in how we plan the network. Helpfully, the energy sector is already moving to a model with much more strategic planning of the system. Given the uncertainty about exactly where and when demand will increase, more robust strategic planning is a key contributor to ensuring the network we need can be built at the right time. Along with the National Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, Ofgem's proposed regional energy strategic plans should help distribution network planning by giving additional certainty and clarity about the investment that is needed at a local level. Policy on this is, in our view, moving in the right direction, but we need to ensure that accountability is clear and that we maximise the value of the new regional plans and provide certainty for the next price control and beyond. That requires strong engagement with local stakeholders and the integration of national and local objectives. And in order to deliver the required investment at least cost efficiently, Ofgem's price control process will also need to evolve. We think the building blocks of the regime are solid, but the current process is too complex and focused on short-term cost of network investment rather than the wider goals of economic growth and achieving net zero. Continuing the current approach risks delaying investment and storing up pressure on networks and supply chains, as well as on the bills of future consumers. Ofgem therefore needs to rebalance the price control around a broader set of long-term objectives, including a greater emphasis on supporting growth and decarbonisation, and more focus on customer service. Funding mechanisms then need to reflect both the rebalanced objectives and the longer term certainty that strategic planning should help provide. That means giving networks more certainty about what they can spend and what they're expected to deliver. Simplification will allow Ofgem to focus its scrutiny where it is most needed, ensuring efficiency and timely delivery of network plans. And there needs to be a stronger role for government in this process. Setting a much clearer vision for the sector will help Ofgem make the trade-offs required. Effective strategic planning and price control reform are probably the core of a proactive investment approach, but other reforms are also needed to support it. I'll now hand over to Andy to talk about how we can improve the experience of connecting to the distribution network. Andy.
Thank you very much, Nick. Now, the first thing to say on connections is clearly there's an awful lot happening in this space already. And when we did the study, we took that into account very carefully. The focus, of course, has been on the transmission network and the transmission issues that exist. And the changes that come in as a result of that should have benefits for distribution connections too. But further action will still be needed. Distribution connections generally take far less time and network customer satisfaction scores are good. However, throughout the study, we've heard about repeated issues with the connections process. It's very clear that customer service can be patchy. There are big differences between operators and incentives are not well aligned. And the basic data you need to work out whether customers are getting good service or not is often lacking. As more and more of society electrifies, it's really important that all network customers receive a high quality of customer service, supported by very clear, simple processes and consistent good practice. This needs to be delivered through stronger incentives for network operators with more robust measurement of performance, as well as a consistent set of minimum standards that embed good practice more widely and make the process easier for all of the customers to navigate. As Nick mentioned earlier, consumer flexibility will be crucial to lowering costs for consumers. The rollout of electric vehicles and heat pumps will lead to new demands on the network, but encouraging customers to use demand more flexibly will reduce the scale of infrastructure needed to support these new technologies. Shifting demand and generation will be critical to meeting the government's 2030 clean power target, and there is a big prize for customers in doing so. In order to capture these benefits, we need to go further and faster on both flexibility and on digitalisation. This means thinking much more about using flexibility in a way that maximises overall system value rather than just that on the local network. It also means making progress on a range of policies that enable consumers to use demand more flexibly, such as committing to the smart meter rollout and ensuring that heat pumps have flexible capabilities by default. Flexibility also links to the next recommendation area around reviewing security of supply standards. Networks are going to face much higher loads, so we need to ensure that they are designed with those demands in mind. A more flexible, digitally capable network should be able to maintain security of supply with a lot less additional investment. We need to make sure standards reflect this appropriately. And I'll pass over to Margaret to talk about the final recommendations around improving delivery.
Thank you, Andy. First point is about the planning system. The slow pace of the planning system for infrastructure is something which the Commission has previously highlighted to government as a major constraint on the pace at which new energy infrastructure can be delivered. We've certainly been encouraged by the government's early commitments to address these issues head on. When it comes to the distribution network, the good news is we don't think that the issues are nearly as complicated as they are for new generation or transmission grids. But there are ambiguities arising from outdated regulations which make it unnecessarily difficult to maintain and upgrade the network. A small number of targeted changes to the planning and consenting regime for distribution infrastructure would speed up delivery and reduce uncertainty for both planners and network operators. Skills and supply chains. Just last month, the UK boss of Siemens warned of a shortage of green skills potentially leading to an energy shortage. Moving to a more proactive approach to distribution network investment can help with this. It can give contractors and operators more confidence earlier about the size of the workforce they'll need, making investing in training easier, and about the amount of kit needed so that manufacturers know what is needed and when, well ahead of time. That's all helpful, but not sufficient. Further action is already being taken on transmission supply chains, and Ofgem will need to consider whether these measures could also work for distribution networks. We also need to think about the workforce who will actually design and build the new infrastructure we need. It's encouraging that government has recognised the skills and workforce challenge, but swift action is needed. There were already shortages of key skills in distribution, particularly jobs like cable jointers and overhead line workers. Distribution networks and their supply chains are competing to fill these and many other roles, with other parts of the energy system, with end users of electricity, and with other utilities. Let's not forget the amount of investment we need in water infrastructure over the coming decades. People take time to be trained up. There are no instant solutions. Government needs a holistic cross-sector plan to build the large, sustainable workforce that will deliver the energy transition, which is why the long-term approach we've outlined today is also about sending an unambiguous signal to the sector about the opportunities coming on stream, making it easier for it to plan ahead and expand its skill base. Hand back to John to close things up.
Well, thanks very much, Margaret. Well, there you are. That's a quick overview of the report. It fills, we believe, one of the gaps that we didn't address in our NIA2 assessment, and we think it answers some important questions about how we secure the country's energy transition. So thank you very much for listening. I'll hand back to James, who's going to manage the Q&A. James.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Nick and Andy, for sharing the findings in the report. We'll now go to questions. It's your opportunity to ask the panel questions. If you want to do that by raising sort of your virtual hands, and I'll take those questions first. Can put questions in chat as well, which I may be able to get to, depending on how many raised hands we've got. And the team online will try and answer some of those questions in the chat function as well. We can probably go till about 12:15, depending on the volume of questions. So let's get started. I see first question from Guy Newey. Guy.
James, hi everyone, and congratulations on the report, which I've had a quick scan of this morning. Particularly delighted to see your push to go further and faster on flex and digitalisation, and it's interesting to see how you've thought about that balance between flexibility and anticipatory investment. My question is actually about the planning, some of the planning elements that you talk about in the report. So you've quite rightly argued that RESP, the Regional Energy System strategic planning, is going to be really important and needed to set up in a way that's going to deliver. But you said it needs to be set up in a way that's going to deliver strong engagement with local stakeholders in particular. And I wondered if you in the report stopped short of saying, in addition to regional to RESPs, that you should have local area energy planning included and mandated. And I just wondered whether that had been part of your considerations, and if so, why you decided against recommending that the government mandate local area energy planning.
Thanks, Guy. I might turn to Nick first on that one.
Nice to see you, Guy. Thank you for your question. One dear to my heart. We didn't go as far as saying that it should be mandated, because we're aware very much of the quite patchy set of capabilities that are out there for some across the variety of local players. So we think we're a bit ahead of that at the moment, but we do expect the programme of RESPs to, probably combined with government's proposed changes to local authority structure, to lead to a comprehensive set of plans that can be integrated together by NISO's management of the whole strategic planning process.
Margaret, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag that a lot of local authorities have got really key levers here that they need to pull. So, for example, they have planning levers on moving from gas to heat pumps or heat networks. They have skills levers that they can pull. So it's really important that local authorities are part of this process, and it's not just a technocratic process, but has that democratic input too.
Thank you, Margaret. I'll go next to Tobias Burke. And Tobias, could you sort of say where you're from when you ask a question as well? I think it was help.
Hello, I'm Tobias Burke. I'm the policy manager at Energy UK for electricity networks. So first of all, on behalf of Energy UK and the membership, I'd like to say that generally that we welcome the report and most of its recommendations and the general overall direction of it. We very much agree with the need for holding networks to account and giving them better incentives and aligning them with best practice. The other sort of like statements regarding the need for better data and the role of flexibility are also highly welcome. The question that I have, and the report understandably doesn't go into too much detail. Indeed, in Ofgem's end-to-end connections review, they also don't go into too much detail. They instead ask for industry input, is what the NIC's view might be on the need for an adaptive planning approach towards building out the network and over the next 1 or 2 price controls. The reason I bring this up is because, unlike at the transmission level, where you're building large load across wide distances, and even though minute need at the local level might be uncertain, wide need across the nation is reasonably more predictable. At the distribution level, considering the amount that needs to be built, there are a myriad more uncertainties, and even more so than in previous price controls when demand was relatively stable, as you mentioned. The price control as it stands at the moment is an incredibly rigid system, with reopeners being incredibly cumbersome and slow processes. And I'd be interested to understand the NIC's view on how such a process, or maybe something different, could be implemented or changed to try and make the approach towards uncertainties in both the price mechanism and business plans more adaptable going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Nick, I might kick off with you again on this. Then turn to others if they have thoughts.
Well, thank you for the question, Tobias. I think we're trying to blend 2 things here. We're seeking an introduction, more generally, of strategic spatial planning, which is very important, is well underway. We're going to link in with that, as Margaret said, a local view for all sorts of good reasons. And this is, of course, entirely appropriate, for these are monopoly elements of the way we run the system. So we need to plan the networks very carefully. It is true, of course, that that actually at distribution level, it depends very much on not just the density of low carbon technologies that are put in, but also the nature of the networks themselves. And they vary largely from place to place. And we've got 7 case studies in the report that show the different effects of that. So in my mind, out of the strategic planning process at the highest level, we will be setting we will be setting a sort of broad forecast of the growth of the distribution networks, but that the local process will then be allowed to input to that and provide course correction at price control time each 5 years. But what we don't want is, we don't want a sort of stop and start process that we've had somewhat in the past, where we go into a price control with almost a blank sheet of paper. It takes a bit of time for the network owners to mobilise, then they slow down a bit at the end of the price control, and then you've got to pick it up again. If you like, the answer to your question is we want an adaptive process, but adapting to an upward line which is supported by the very broad electrification of the economy that we see.
Andy,
I think you need a guiding light. Clearly, it's an adaptive process. The guiding light ought to be the quality of service delivered both to small transmission and to consumers and businesses to enable them to drive forward the electrification of our economy, which is so crucial for growth. And I think the industry and Ofgem need to work together with that in mind. But what we don't need is lots and lots of reopeners. We need an adaptive process for sure, but that reflects that growth. But I think the guiding light should be that quality of service that's delivered to the end user.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll go to Nicola. Sorry, Nicola, I should have brought you in before, but I can't see the screen properly in the room. Apologies.
Hello, I'm Nicola Pitts. I'm Executive Director of the Independent Networks Association. I wanted to echo John's point about feeling that some things have been overlooked in this report, one being the independent sector as a whole, which has now nearly 2 million customers and therefore are larger than some of the distribution network operators, and also, as was not brought out in the report, have increased because developers like competitive networks that provide a project-focused approach, not just to housing, as stated in the report, but also at the EHV level and into the transmission network, and therefore are connecting increasingly EV charging, data centers, generation, and battery storage. And they do this on a competitive basis. My question is, in terms of the report, it doesn't bring out the role of competition within networks. I wondered if that was a deliberate point, or and whether the Commission didn't see a role for competition in network provision going forwards.
Thank you, Nicola. I'll just bring in Nick, and then I might bring in Margaret as well to answer that one.
Thank you, Nicola, for your question, and lovely to see you again. This is a convention of all my mates from the past here. Yeah, very good point indeed, and the Commission certainly isn't taking a position that the independent sector shouldn't play a role here. I think that the broader strategic planning will give a much clearer horizon and a clearer view of where the opportunities may be for independent network providers. So I think that's good news. I would expect that, I mean, this is for Ofgem, of course, in terms of its design of the RESP programme, but I would assume that Ofgem will be consulting independent network providers as well as other stakeholders in trying to form those plans. So I don't think we aren't taking a position either in for or against, either in favour or against the provision of competition in these areas. We're taking a position on the need to enhance the network one way or another.
Yeah, the key point is the strategic need. We, as we've previously said, we really do believe in the role of competition in regulated networks where it's appropriate, and we expect IDNOs to play a strong role in, for example, connecting new housing. So it's really important that they are part of the process. And we do mention them in the report, Nicola. It's just not massively running all the way through. Thank you.
Thank you. Go next to Henry.
Morning, everyone. Sorry, am I on mute? No. You can hear me, good. Morning, everyone. I'm Henry Green from Ofgem. Thank you for the event and the report. I just wanted to ask if you could expand a bit on the point you made about the sort of need to focus more on economic growth through the price control, and sort of what you felt the key points in that were. Thanks.
John, do you want to?
Well, I think I mean, clearly the starting point really in terms of all of our infrastructure and the expectations of it is that fundamentally this country is considerably lacking in economic growth at the moment. And it's lacking in economic growth, particularly outside of London. When you've got a situation where the only city in the country which has a greater than average economic growth is GDP growth is London. So what we have here is an opportunity to better ensure that there are no handicaps or barriers to businesses developing, or indeed the 1.5 million homes that we need to build being taken forward. This comes back to the whole issue of spatial planning, of course, and understanding across the country where the different needs are, which has already been talked about today. But I mean, given that the country is fundamentally going to be reliant on electricity, then the role of electricity and the successful and effective delivery of that electricity to whoever needs it for whatever business that they are operating, and to grow those businesses and grow through that, grow the economy, is fundamental. And therefore the effectiveness of our networks is critical. And therefore, and if we don't do that, then we're just creating a handicap to our ability to get the economic growth that we need. So, as I say, given that we are fundamentally going to be an electrified society, then it's vitally important that in fact we do get electricity to all the parts that matter. A bit like the old lager advert. Reaching all those parts where it's required. So I think that's our fundamental point here.
Andy, do you want to explain?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk to people, not just of course about the distribution network, but widely, you hear from developer after developer. You hear from people seeking new electric generation projects. You hear from individuals that their ability to get projects moving fast is heavily affected by a range of issues, not, by the way, just electricity, but by a range of issues. But as John says, electrification is absolutely essential for all of these things and will be more and more so. So I think, our argument is that the government needs to make it clear to Ofgem that, as well as its duty around protecting bills, which has been fulfilling well, in an environment where we need to be growing our electricity network, it needs to have a responsibility for supporting economic growth and ensuring that people can get service quickly and efficiently across the network, because otherwise we'll hold back the economic growth of the country.
Okay. I shall move on to the next question from Peter. So it's Peter Emery, sorry, rather than the second Peter. Are you there, Peter Emery?
Yes, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, I can now. Yeah, brilliant.
Hi. Yeah, so Pete Emery, I'm the chair of the Greater Manchester Strategic Infrastructure Board and ex-chief exec of Electricity North West. I want to talk a little bit about the risk analysis you did. I was very pleased to hear Nick talk about the risks of building ahead of need are now possibly greater than building after the need has developed. To my own knowledge, many of us in the industry have been concerned about this for 5 to 10 years. So this is great that it's recognised, but there's a lot of detail beneath that headline. The only concern I've got, I support the general direction of travel. It all makes sense. It's very logical, which is what I would expect. The issue will be that the strategy will have to be able to respond to changes in the market. Those graphs all look nice and smooth, but what will happen is suddenly the price of EVs will halve, or the price of electricity will drop, or the price of fossil fuels will go up because of government tax, or the price of batteries will drop dramatically, and that will stimulate a lot of demand. And that's when the strategic plan needs to be fairly robust. I was a bit concerned. I heard Sir John on the radio this morning suggesting you're going to spend an extra 2 billion a year for 25 years. That's not really going to deliver. If you don't invest ahead of need, then the market will be slow to respond. People aren't buying EVs now because the infrastructure is not there. This plan, I would suggest, needs to think a little bit more about having it a bit more front-end loaded, and also how much flexibility is in there to respond to dramatic shifts in the market, which today's strategic plan probably won't recognise.
Peter, I mean, the comment I made this morning was very much, I suppose, what you might say on the radio, which is keep it simple, stupid. And therefore saying, look, guys, this is going to be 50 billion over the next 25 years, which is roughly a couple of billion a year. You're absolutely right. I mean, and this comes back to the adaptive comment being made earlier, that, you've got to be able to adapt to recognizing changing needs, recognizing acceleration. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the whole objective here is we don't want to be in a catch-up situation as we've found ourselves with the transmission networks, and to avoid being in a catch-up, you probably do need to have a front-end loaded program. But it can only be front-end loaded to the ability of the industry to deliver, of course. And one of the things we know that we're going to have here is a skills challenge, not just here, but across all our different infrastructure programs. So we might say, well, we want to go off like a bang, but actually we might not then be able to because of restrictions on capacity. So yes, you're right. Let's not fall behind. Let's make sure that we are recognizing the changes, as you say, in the market, the likelihood of reduction in the cost of EVs, etc. And that's why you need to have a program which is adaptive. That then becomes a bit of a challenge, clearly, for the regulator to work out how to do that with the supply chain, with the network operators. But Nick, do you want to add anything?
I would just, very nice to see you, Peter. So the sense of the report, there is a very real sense of we should get ahead. We are saying that in most areas of the network at the moment, there's still capacity. We know there's some pinch points, but the philosophy really is about setting a curve of investment that is by and large getting ahead, because we know with distribution likely to double to 2050, even if we get ahead by a year or two, and some of the investment is underutilized, it's going to be for a very short period of time. So I think in some senses, as government and Ofgem think about this and look at our report, they will very much think about the idea of what is the right sort of average slope, so that, to your point, Peter, if there are changes in the environment which lead to a sudden, increase in electric vehicles, that we've already got we've kept some capacity in the system to respond to that, because actually the cost of not doing so, we think, is much greater than the cost of maybe being a year early on fully utilizing a piece of the investment.
Okay, thank you.
I'll now turn to second Peter McCrory.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Pete McCrory from Renewable UK. First of all, thanks to the Commission for this report, especially given the transformational effect NIC's transmission report had. I'm really excited to see what actions come out of this report and where we can go. I'm going to be quite cheeky and ask two questions, actually. The first one being on the RESPs and the strategic planning piece in general. Does the Commission have a view on how much influence that should have in the sort of more traditional planning, so like within Town and Country Planning Acts, and how important they should be seen within planning, like the sort of capital P planning decisions? And then secondly, obviously at the minute government have announced a review of Ofgem, and this report makes a number of recommendations about Ofgem's price control process. I was wondering what level of engagement the Commission intends to have with that review.
Thank you. I'll go to Margaret for the first question on RESPs and capital P planning, and then I might think about how I'm going to come to the second question.
Thanks.
Margaret.
Thanks, Peter, for your question. So we haven't recommended a direct relationship between RESPs and planning, but we are thinking quite hard about spatial planning more generally and how they should interact with each other. And we do think it's really important that with that local democratic input into the RESP process, those local authorities can then pull their relevant planning levers, which includes, as you say, the planning permissions and developing their strategic development strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, do you want to question number 2?
And in terms of Ofgem and the review on that, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the recommendations in this report do go with the grain of where Ofgem, over how Ofgem have been talking about the development of the price control mechanisms. So and I note that Ofgem have been supportive of this report, and of course we've chatted to them along the way as we've chatted to all stakeholders. So it seems to me that that there is a quite wide degree of agreement that moving to this more strategic process is the right thing to do at this point, because we've, as John said, it's been a pretty steady sort of business, but now there's going to be a dramatic acceleration in the need for distribution infrastructure. So in terms of the review of Ofgem, I'm sure we will respond to that review and make representations. I'm sure that the content of this report will be a key input into that review in terms of how we can make Ofgem fit for the future, which is very much this growth of networks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I'll go to the next question. Theodora, sorry if I've mangled your name, but Theodora, do you want to?
No, that's correct. Thank you so much. Theodora Kaniva, Head of Infrastructure at Tech UK. Thank you so much for this morning and the report, and we're particularly happy with the acknowledgement that there is a disparity between distribution network operations, and we represent most of the data center operators in the UK. So we're very happy that there are some specific areas mentioned in the report around digitalization and also the connections issues specifically for our sector. I just yes, and really also happy that data centers have been identified as integral to data-driven economy. I would add to any digitally enabled economy as well. But there's a couple of things that we are slightly concerned, and certainly data centers being mentioned that they're a new industry, which they really aren't, and power hungry as well. This is a term that it's quite derogatory because it's really about consumer adoption of digital services and digitalization of industries that drives the demand for data center capacity. So I think there should be a big distinction between that and why we need data centers and why they are growing at the rate that they are growing. They indeed are integral to a future economy, specifically now with the AI Opportunities Act and the fact that the UK wants to be a global leader, or at least a global competitor of artificial intelligence. So I just wanted to ask the Commission specifically on, there is a mention in the report that the cross-sector impacts of data center growth should be addressed as part of the 10-year infrastructure strategy. Can you just clarify if and what this means in particular? And because it does sound a little bit like, because it is not directly, it's not directly part of the energy sector, it should be dealt outside of strategic planning. And we think that also in the strategic energy planning and regional energy planning, that these are massive investors in the UK. So we have concerns that we are segregated to an area where technology sits very separately from the planning of the energy system. And do you have a view on how both both industries could actually collaborate better and coordinate alongside industrial growth. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll ask Margaret to respond.
Thank you. So you wrapped up quite a lot in there, Theodora. So let me try and respond quite quickly, and then we can potentially have a separate conversation afterwards if that would be helpful. We think it's really important that the data center sector is part of the RESP process. So they need to be putting into the process what their needs are and where. And that is the crucial point. Location matters when it comes to energy planning and water planning. So it's really important that that's part of the process. We also think that where it's possible for data centers to be in different places, then it might be possible to provide some spatial coordination or direction from government. So that's what we mean when we talk about it being thought about in the 10-year infrastructure strategy, and the energy needs, but also the water needs of data centres and the opportunities that data centres provide for heat need to be thought about in the round rather than on a sector by sector basis.
Thank you. Andy?
Look, I think Theodore is a fair cop, but I think, you know, both for the electricity and the water industry, it feels like a new trend, you know, whether you like it or not. And I think we need to make a real statement in this report that this is a very important part of the economic growth of the country, and that we need to be properly planning for it. And Margaret set out some of the ways we need to be taking that through to the infrastructure strategy that's coming out early next financial year. And it clearly is right up at the top of government's agenda, and therefore at the top of our agenda. Somebody else who comes from the sector, I understand it's not new, but it is clearly showing significant strains both in the water sector and in the electricity sector. And I think the industry can do a lot of thinking. I mean, it's not quite clear to me why we have to have everything in the southeast of England, why some of it couldn't be in Scotland, you know, for some of the things which would reduce the cost of the transmission network and the distribution network very substantially. So I think there are a lot of things
actually the services need latency. So if you have a massive financial sector in London...
Not all of them don't, Theodora. You know very well not all of them do, and so do I. So some do, some don't.
Yeah. Well, you know, 90% of them do.
Okay, look, we can certainly continue this one offline. It is a very important subject. But I want to just move on, to keep things going, move on to the next question from Phil Jones.
Just give you a bit of a layup of a name that you definitely won't mangle. So well done. No worries there. And good morning, everybody. Thank you. And just on kind of behalf of my company and the ENO, who've had a lot of engagement with you, Margaret and the team, thank you. Obviously, tons of work gone into a very effective, I think, report, and I'm optimistic for the positive impact it will have. So thank you. And I guess, colleagues, at the risk of sounding like it's one of those questions that isn't a question, it's a statement. It's honestly not. I'll get the statement out up front. I'm keen just to get your comments on two aspects of going forward. Kind of around implementation, and not ignoring the fact that there's some changes for your own organisation brewing as well, in terms of what that might look like. Just be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But perhaps more specifically on the subject around sequencing of the things. If I frame it, and here's where it sounds a risk like it's a comment, but I'll be brief. If I think of this in three buckets: the investability, deliverability, and then getting customers supportive of it. If you think of those three things that obviously interact, I'm just curious and around your take on the interaction, because John, I think you highlighted it in your answer to Peter earlier. It's one thing to say we want to get ahead. It's another thing to be able to get ahead. And one of the things you need in order to get ahead with deliverability and supply chains is the certainty of investment. And that so they become circular. And I think I don't think it's a secret that I would say, I think, as you've highlighted quite accurately, Ofgem's been very focused on its core duty to look at prices. I would say to the extent of pushing too much of the current costs off onto future customers in a way that in the end, very now needs to be addressed. So we've been very focused on the price now. That was definitely true last time. If you look at the price control we've got today, it was written all over it in explicit terms. That's what it's designed to do. Avoid doing anything that doesn't need doing, and deal with the cost of living crisis that was present at the time. In a sense, without throwing that baby out with the bathwater, you guys are saying, look, we've got to look further than that, and we've got to be willing to think about it. I'm just curious about your comments around what you see as the nature of the dependencies and how to kind of thread that needle. What needs to happen first so that other things can happen? If you want a supply chain, you need an investment commitment. If you want an investment commitment, you need customers on board. And how do you see your own part in that as you become a different body that will have a view on implementation? So over to you.
Thanks, Phil. I might ask John and Nick to have some thoughts on this.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, you're spot on with the challenge. And one of the things which we're doing at the moment is supporting Treasury in the development of the 10-year infrastructure strategy. And of course, this, as you say, this is all circular. And what the 10-year infrastructure strategy will seek to do, and this isn't going to all happen on day one, but what clearly is people ask for is a pipeline of opportunity, a pipeline of what government foresees coming forward. Now that pipeline, we believe, is going to have to be, it'll be one thing in June, it'll be something better the June after that, and it'll be something even better the June after that. This isn't something we're going to get right on day one, and it needs to be developed. And you talk about the role of NISTA. I mean, that is clearly very much part of the role of NISTA, is to be the two ends of the equation. One, helping with that strategic thinking, working through what is the right pipeline, what things need to go into the pipeline. And then equally looking at, well, how do we deliver that? How do we make sure that we've got the right resources in place to deliver? So yes, it is circular, and it can only be circular if you get continuity of thinking, which again is hopefully something which NISTA will be able to support government with, so that we don't keep bouncing around as we have done in the past, but we get a better stability of that forecast, and we can start to. I mean, in the past, I think, I'm sure you would agree with us, the pipeline has never really had much credibility. It's been a list of projects, and without really the rigor which is required to be provided to that pipeline as to, is this something which is just a wish list, or is this something which is really deliverable? And that, I think, is going to be very much the challenge going forward, is to produce a pipeline which people start to trust. People can actually see this is the thing which is going to enable to make the investments that they need to make on the supply side. And whether it's in labour, whether it's in new manufacturing techniques for the products which are necessary, whatever it is, they need confidence that the government is actually going to stick to the knitting and stick to the programme. And that, I think, is very much going to be a challenge for NISTA, is to maybe more internally than externally than we have in the past. So I mean, we recognise that NISTA is going to be more inside government than outside, so we might not be shouting for the roofs off that government's messed it up, but be sure that we will be saying to them internally that, come on guys, we're not doing what we said we would do, and this has got to change and that's got to change.
Nick?
Yeah, on the sequencing piece, yeah, I mean, we're clear in the report that that we're moving from a sort of steady state position on electricity distribution to a significant, long period actually of growth. So investability, I'm sure you'll make your representations over time very strongly to Ofgem about investability. I mean, clearly capital has to come into the sector in a slightly different way than has been the case in the past. So that's a legitimate part of the debate with Ofgem, which I'm sure you'll be engaging on. In terms of you then said about deliverability. Well, thank you. That's a great opportunity for me to raise other points in the report, which are around supply chain and skills. So we do think having a much clearer sense of we're entering into a growth period, and this is the shape of it, and we've got a solid process to identify the detail of that upward curve. We do think that will give a very important thing to the supply chain, which is a view of the likely order book and an encouragement for both international supply chains and domestic supply chains, particularly in terms of distribution, to accelerate and provide new capacity And of course, the report also nods to the idea that, you know, Ofgem and others may want to think more strategically about encouraging the supply chain, as indeed they are on the transmission side with the advanced procurement mechanism. I think that's the right word for it. So that's important. Skills, of course, you know, we all spend all of our time sort of, you know, mentioning on and off the skills crunch that we've got in the UK in terms of engineers and technicians. This, I hope, just adds another piece of weight to the importance of thinking about that strategically, which of course you and I have discussed and was brought out in my report as well. And then on bringing customers with us, I think, you know, we've made some comments on service and unlooping and so on, and things that the industry can do. But also, you know, a process of advocacy that comes through this report, and things like Clean Power 2030 that says, you know, says society quite clearly this the direction of travel, and you know, sings you know, its benefits, because I really do think this transition is very good for customers. So I think there's a few things on sequencing there.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Phil. So I've got 3 hands up, which I want to get through, but then I'm going to close the door on further questions so we can finish on time. So I'll move next to Merlin.
Hi, yeah. It's taking a bit of time to unmute there, but hopefully you can hear me. So just to say, firstly, really pleased to work with you on this piece of work and contribute to the analysis. So really in a very positive project. I think from our point of view, we've been kind of, I guess, pressing the case for a while at Regen that the distribution networks are kind of slightly underappreciated in terms of these are now critical infrastructure for the net zero transition, for electrification, etc. So I think that, you know, congratulations to the NIC for taking that on and putting out this report, which I think really is a big step forward now in sort of bringing that up and really making sure that that's recognised as absolutely critical. So really positive. I think my question was a bit about the kind of, if you like, the kind of how you see the interplay between kind of, I guess, copper and smart and flex. And I think it might be fair to say that there's been a slightly unfortunate, maybe over the last few years, sort of, you know, it's one or the other. You know, there's the advocates, we just need less copper, and then people are saying we can only need copper, we can all just be very clever and smart and data driven. And I think we're beginning to see that of course that actually it's both. You can't electrify the entire sector of transport and heat of the country without some more copper, but you want to do that in an absolutely data driven, smart, clever, you know, minimal way. You don't want to do more than you have to, when you want to do it in the right way, in the right place, intelligently. So I mean, that I think that's becoming clear and starts to come out in the report. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you see that and whether we can, can we put that false dilemma to bed?
Nick, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you for that, Merlin. I absolutely agree with you. It is a false choice in a sense. We need to very sensibly deploy both, and of course they have different characteristics, but both will be really useful. We've said very clearly in the report a couple of things. We've said that our assessment is that a very positive approach to flex is needed to help defray some of this investment. We've said 15% of the investment can be defrayed by a very positive approach to flex. That's 7 billion by 2050 saved. But we've also said something else very clearly in the report, which is an important contribution, I think, to this issue, that we think that flex has a very high national worth, and although we're seeing it deployed to reduce the expenditure on the distribution system, what we're saying very clearly is it would be a mistake to use up that flex and trap it in the distribution system, given that we see, and I think we've got figures in there, flex potential worth nationally of 10 billion a year. So times 25, that's 250 billion. It's a much bigger number that we see of using flex nationally than using it all in the distribution system. We do think quite often those things will line up, and that a particular flex activity will help the local network, the transmission network, and the wholesale market to balance. But we also know, and I don't think I need to tell you this, that in many cases those needs for a wind farm to come off or come on, batteries to push power out to the grid or take in, they may be in opposition to each other at a wholesale versus transmission versus distribution level. And so we've very carefully deployed, keenly deployed flex, but in a way that enables it to have access to the wholesale market where we see its big value.
Thank you, Nick. Phil, let's go next.
Hi there, Phil Beach. I'm the Chief Exec of Energy and Utility Skills. So obviously I've got a keen focus on the skills and workforce point, and particularly recommendation 14, which is really encouraging to see. I guess my point is one of emphasis and pace, really. So I think just flagging on the recommendations about trying to understand the size and scale of the skills and workforce challenge, we've spent quite a long time looking at that in quite excruciating detail. We think we know not just the headline numbers, that by role and by timing exactly what we need and where. I think what we would like the report to reflect on is that there are some burning platforms to delivery, particularly some of the timelines highlighted, and that we should be focused on actioning that rather than admiring the problem further. So when we talk about reference to a skills and workforce study by the end of 2025, I think that's great, and I think that'll be really helpful. But I think it would be really helpful if we could encourage, as we see the development of Skills England and the development of the Office of Clean Energy Job, a report that recommends cutting through that and identifying some pilots to get some quick wins to address some of these immediate challenges.
Thank you. John.
Phil, we just go round and round in circles, don't we? I mean, we've been talking about this for the last 30 years. And I have to say it's something which, having been the chairman of City and Guilds and having seen the consequences of the last levy, which hasn't worked, just how do you at the end of the day? And I think this is a question very much to companies and colleges and educationalists, is how do you actually get an increased number of people coming into these sectors? And I'm not sure there's very much, personally, I'm not sure this is a task of government. My view would be that government needs to provide the right raw stock, if you like, at the age of 16 to 18, where in fact you've got people who are actually capable of passing a basic sort of entry to, can this person be an apprentice? Because at the moment, the basic skills of just English and maths are not there, to the point where you say, well, where am I going to get my next load of apprentices from? So I basket this up in two things. One is, government, please will you focus on education and provide the right feedstock? And then colleges and employers, can you get together and understand how best you can enable the qualifications? And to my mind, the qualification is, should it be fit for the job? And that might mean an entirely different qualification to, well, you've got to have a 5-year apprenticeship in mechanical or electrical engineering, because a lot of jobs don't require that. And that's where I think employers need to bite the bullet and say, look, this is what I actually want. Now let's sit down with colleges and say, now what is the training that's required to do that, and what part can we play as employers, and what part can you play as colleges? And because at the end of the day, this can only be solved by people willing to invest in that. And I have to say, I think most of that investment has to come from the private sector. And then we come back to the pipeline and everything else, which says, well, what is going to give the private sector the certainty that this is an investment worthwhile? So it's all a bit circular. But personally, I don't think this is something which we should expect to hang on the door of government. I would argue government should focus on education and leave training to the people who understand it best, which is, what do I need? How can that be delivered to me by local colleges and universities working with employers, much the way that they've always done it in Central Europe? Sorry if that's a bit blunt, but
Yeah, I would recognise and agree with a lot of what you say. I guess there's a lot that sits underneath that, and certainly as an organisation we're working with employers to do exactly what you say. But there are certainly some things that government can do to facilitate some of that. The answer isn't always an apprenticeship programme. There are constraints to how many apprentices you can put through for all the reasons you would understand. And for me, the idea is how we create pathways from, let's say, getting the 946,000 people that are NEET at the moment into some high quality jobs. So I think there's something for us to do, but I do think there's a partnership between government and industry to make that work better.
Yep. I mean, it's encouraging to read the other day that this year we've seen an increase in the number of people applying to do engineering at university. So people recognizing if I want a job at the end of the day, then these hard skills, if you like, in engineering are much more likely to give me a decent job than some of the others that have been fashionable.
Okay, I'll give the last question to Chris.
Great, thank you, James. Hi, everybody. So Chris Birchall of SSE Networks Distribution. Thank you and congratulations to the Commission on the report and for the widespread engagement that you enacted during the production. I have to say that SSEN is strongly supportive of the findings and obviously very keen to support implementation activities that may follow from here. But I just wanted to raise a quick angle on consumer confidence, if I can, and it potentially links to the point that Phil Jones raised in bringing customers with us. Clearly, you've pointed out and made a strong case that the cost of a reactive approach to distribution investment is likely to be far greater than the cost of a proactive approach. And we absolutely agree with that at SSEN. I just wonder, does the Commission have a view on how we might define or assess that optimal and ongoing efficiency as we go through the growth phase, particularly as we're seeing regional variations between networks, and we will do, which hopefully RESPs will capture. But I think the key point here is how do we as a sector give confidence to consumers that we're doing the right thing for them, particularly as they might start to see the network element of bills rise?
I'm glad you've saved an easy question for last, Chris. But if any panel want to jump in there, Andy, and then I might...
I mean, Chris, in my view, in the end, the industry needs to set out a promise to consumers and say, we're making these investments, but that means if you want to, if the things that are going to bring jobs to your area, if the things you want to do in terms of heating your house or the way you want to move to an electric car, we'll make sure that we deliver for you on time in a way that's simple and straightforward and allows you to get on with the things that grow the economy. And I think, somehow you need to get over a sense across the industry that this investment is worthwhile and that it really delivers for people, both in terms of what goes on in their day-to-day lives and in terms of jobs growth in their region.
Nick, and then I'll give John. John and then Nick.
The only thing I'd add to that is that when you look at our second national infrastructure assessment and the work on the path of energy bills, and then you look at our work here and the path of the distribution components of energy bills, the timing differences aren't very great. Actually, we said in the early 2030s that, or mid 2030s, did we, that the transition itself, all other things being equal, can knock £200 off people's energy bills for a year. And interestingly, as you look at our £5 to £25 per year per customer, which is the cost of this proactive approach to electricity distribution, that gets up to about £20 in roughly the same time scale. So happily, we're not saying to customers, you have to put in loads and loads of money now for the benefit of people a lot later. These things, line up reasonably well. We might be, a year or two ahead in starting to have to fund some of this stuff, but by and large, the benefits flow, roughly around the same time as the costs, partly because, of course, the distribution systems are invested in by your private investors who then smooth those costs over the lifetime of the assets. So I just wanted to add that, you know, it does fit together well.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, clearly the proof of the pudding in all of this is for the consumer and what he sees drop through his letterbox or appear on his phone as to what his charge is going to be. And there is a tension between the short-term immediacy of that. It's something which plays into the politics. It's something which plays into the newspaper headlines. And we tend to focus on the downside rather than the upside. But the reality, of course, of the upside is that the more we can improve the electrification of the economy and the more reliability that has, then the more naturally people will move to seeing the benefit and recognizing that a smart meter is not a bad thing. A smart meter is something which enables them to manage their bills. And equally, as somebody mentioned earlier, you know, as the cost of EVs comes down, the cost of heat pumps comes down, people are going to be wanting to move into there. And I think I've said this about many of these utility challenges that we face, not only in electricity, is that we've got to be on the front foot all the time with being willing to be out there and explaining to the consumer what it is we're about, why we're doing it, be honest about it. You know, the kidology is the thing they'll see through first. So if there is something which is going to cost a bit more in the short term, then be honest about it, but be prepared to spend the time and the energy and maybe the advertising from somebody like yourselves to, you know, this is what we're doing, guys. This is why we're doing it. It's for you at the end of the day. You know, give us your feedback, you know, accept that we're going to get some rocks thrown at us, but that we're all in this together for the long-term improvements. And there is, you know, I think a lot we can do by being more open and frank about some of these challenges. And being upfront, and you know, we need to work with politicians to make sure that those messages get put across in the right way.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
And you've brought us in, John, at 12:15, where we're going to conclude this session. I say a huge thank you for everybody who's joined. For those who have joined, you've witnessed a small piece of history in the sense that this is the final report published by the NIC before we merge with the IPA and become NISTA. And I suppose from my perspective, I think it's shown sort of the best of the NIC in terms of the analytical approach, the policy clarity, the way in which they sort of shined a light on a sort of underdeveloped area of policy and worked with many of you on the call in order to develop those recommendations and analysis. So a huge thank you from me to you all, and also to Margaret and the team who have led this piece of work, and two commissioners. Clearly the implementation challenge comes next, and that's where NISTA comes in and how NISTA can work with DESNZ and Ofgem industry to actually see a different regulatory approach in this space and indeed across most utility networks going forward. And I'm sure NISTA will play a core role in that. So unless there's any final comments from commissioners or from Margaret, we'll John, you look poised to say a final word.
No, I was just going to say thank you to you all for coming on this morning. Thank you for the quality of the questions. You know, the questions have shown a deep understanding of this. As James has said, I think this is a report which Margaret and the team can be very, very proud of, and it's a fitting one for us to move on to pastures new in the form of NISTA, and hopefully NISTA can continue to provide the quality of analysis that I think we've managed to do over the last 10 years as the NIC. And that analysis, of course, so often has been because of the contribution that you as the key stakeholders have made in the consultations that we've had when putting these reports together. So once again, thank you all very much, and thank you for attending this morning.
Thank you.